Delighted to be talking here today at this Congress. I'm going to briefly, and I've obviously only got 15 minutes, talk about what I call technological addictions. What I'm going to briefly do is define what I think is addiction, because what you think is addiction may be different to how I define it. I'm going to look at also what I call these technological addictions. I briefly want to talk about some of the generic risk factors for online addictions and what makes technology very attractive to people. I then want to talk about what we call the findings from meta-analytic studies, and I'll tell you what those are a bit later on. And then I'm going to briefly look at the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic on these particular forms of online behaviors, and then do a few conclusions. Now, one of my favorite quotes in the addiction literature says that certain individuals use certain substances in certain ways thought at certain times to be unacceptable by certain other individuals for reasons both certain and uncertain. Now, obviously here we're just talking about drug addictions. We're not even talking about addictions that don't involve the ingestion of a psychoactive substance. So when you start to talk about things like gambling addiction, video game addiction, social media addiction, internet addiction, is that this particular quote becomes even more complex. But when I'm talking to my students about addiction, I always say to them, you have to have a definition of what it is to be addicted in the first place. And the particular definition that I use is actually a one that dates back to 1988, that says that addictive behavior is a repetitive habit pattern that increases the risk of disease and/or associated personal or social problems, often experienced subjectively as a loss of control. And these habit patterns are typically characterized by immediate gratification, the short-term rewards, often coupled with delayed deleterious effects, the long-term costs, and attempts to actually change an addictive behavior, either by a treatment or self-initiation, are typically marked by high relapse rates. Now, the reason I like this particular definition is there is no mention there of a drug. It basically talks about a behavior. And I've spent the last 35 years studying what we call behavioral addictions, addictions that do not involve anybody taking a drug. I started out on gambling addiction, then I went on to video game addiction, then I went on to internet addiction, and since then I've studied lots of different types of addiction, including sex addiction, work addiction, exercise addiction, and social media addiction. Now, in terms of technological addictions, I coined the phrase technological addictions back in a paper that I wrote in 1995, and I said that technological addictions are defined as non-chemical behavioral addictions that involve excessive human-machine interaction. And more importantly is that these behaviors, they usually contain what we call inducing and reinforcing features, which actually might contribute to the promotion of addictive tendencies within individuals. And even more importantly, when I kind of define an addictive behavior, I believe there are 6 core components that we find in any type of addictive behavior. And if you don't fulfill or endorse all of these 6 components, then I don't define that as a genuine addictive behavior. So my 6 components are what we call salience, mood modification, tolerance, withdrawal, conflict, and relapse. And very simply, what this means is within the first component, and what I'll do, I'll use the example of social media. So if I was going to say, is social media, can it be genuinely addictive? Then I would expect all of these 6 components to be there for an individual who was suffering from social media addiction. So the first component is salience, and this would mean that social media use is the single most important thing in this person's life. They do it to the neglect of everything else in their life, and even if they're not actually engaged in social media use, they're thinking about the next time that they're going to do it. The second component is what we call mood modification, and this means is that people would be using social media either to get high, to get aroused, to get buzzed up, to get high, or in fact to do the exact opposite. They use social media to escape, to relax, to tranquilize, to escape, or to numb feelings. The third component is tolerance, and this means that people would need more and more social media activity than to be built up over time. So you may start off being on social media for an hour a day. 6 months later, you may be doing it 4 or 5 hours a day. A year later, you may be doing it 10, 11, or 12 hours a day. Then we've got what we call withdrawal symptoms. And so people who are genuinely addicted to social media, if they are unable to log on to their accounts and check their social media on a psychological level, they would experience, increased irritability, increased frustration, increased moodiness, but also on a physiological level, people would experience things like nausea, stomach cramps, hand sweats, the same types of withdrawal symptoms that you find in other more traditional drug addictions. The most important component is the fifth one here, what we call conflict. And this would mean is the social media activity is so conflicting in this person's life is that it interferes with their relationships, your partner, your wife, your husband, your children, your friends. It conflicts with your educational or occupational activities, depending on how old you are. And also social media use would also experience what I call intrapsychic conflict within themselves. They know they're on social media too much. They know they should probably try and cut down and stop, but they feel unable to do so, and they experience a subjective loss of control. And then finally, we've got relapse. And this basically means if somebody has managed to stop engaging in social media use for 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, or even 2 years, is that when they start going and engaging in social media use again, they go straight back into the addictive cycles they were in before. So my basic message from this one slide is that if any behavior, whether it's video game playing, social media, your internet use, your smartphone use, if any of these behaviors fulfill these 6 components, then I would define that as a genuine addictive behavior. Now, the good news is that very few people in relation to their social media use or their video game use would actually fulfill all of these 6 criteria. Some people, for instance, might endorse 3 of them or 4 of them. And in that situation, I would say these people are problematic users rather than being addicted users. Now, other things in terms of, what is it about being online that makes things particularly attractive and may actually facilitate online addictive behaviors? Well, the first 3 factors are what have been called the AAA engine. And this talks about accessibility, affordability, and anonymity. It basically says that because the internet is highly accessible, it's now become highly affordable, and that when people are online, they feel very anonymous. These 3 things are particularly reinforcing and rewarding, which means that some people end up spending a lot of time online, and a very small amount of those people that spend a lot of time online then become addicted. Another set of characteristics is what's known as the ACE model, and this talks about anonymity, convenience, and escape. And this model says that the attractions of being online are the fact that people are anonymous, the fact that the internet is now very convenient, and the fact that when people go online and they're on social media or they're gambling or gaming or engaging in sexual behavior online, they feel great feelings of escape. 2 other factors that have been what I would call generic factors that are important in terms of the development of online addictions is disinhibition. And this is the idea that when we go online, we lower our emotional guard, and we actually, if you like, we become more of ourselves, because when you're online, there is kind of less stigma, less alienation. The fact that people aren't necessarily seeing each other face to face and are actually using words, etc., means that people become disinhibited. And also what we've seen over the last 2 decades is that the going online and engaging in behaviors online, and just like this conference today being online, it's now very socially acceptable to do so. Now, what I'm going to do now is briefly take you through what I call meta-analytic studies that have looked at these various technological addictions. And what meta-analytic studies are these studies where they basically combine all the findings that have been done in a particular area, combine all the findings together to get a real picture of what the true situation is in relation to different types of behavior. So a study that was published in 2020 by Pan and colleagues, they investigated the prevalence rates of internet addiction and internet gaming disorder. And what they did, they put 113 studies that had been done on these areas, and they put all the results together. And this was actually over 690,000 individuals across 31 different countries. And what they found was that the prevalence rate for internet addiction was just over 7%. And the prevalence rate for internet gaming disorder was just under 2.5%. A more recent study by Cheng et al., they investigated the prevalence rates of social media addiction. And here they took the findings from 63 different studies across 32 different countries with just under 35,000 individuals. And what they found was that their estimate for social media addiction was 5%, particularly for those studies that were the higher quality studies using more strict classifications of addictive behavior. Another study by Stevens et al., they looked at internet gaming disorder, and they looked at just under 250,000 individuals across 53 studies in 17 different countries. And what they reported is that the prevalence of internet gaming disorder was just over 3%. But when they looked at those studies that were the highest quality studies and more representative studies, what they found was that there was actually a slightly lower rate of just below 2% of people who who had internet gaming disorder. And they also found that males were more likely to have internet gaming disorder than females, and the ratio was about 2.5 to 1. Another study done in 2021 by Christiansen et al. Did a meta-analysis again looking at internet gaming disorder, but they specifically looked at the relationship between gaming problems and sleep problems. And they looked at 34 different studies with just over 50,000 individuals. And they said that they found that internet gaming disorder was actually significantly associated with both poor sleep quality, daytime sleepiness, and sleep problems more generally. And then the final two meta-analytic studies that I just want to talk about is a study by Cheng et al. They looked at the relationship between internet gaming disorder and psychological well-being. And here they looked at the findings of 84 different studies with just under 60,000 individuals across 20 different countries. And what they found was that there was a moderately strong positive association between the symptoms of internet gaming disorder and psychological problems, including things like depression, anxiety, and stress across these different countries. And then finally, there was a study that was done in 2019 by Vahidi and Zanella, and they looked at a meta-analytic study that looked at social media use and also problematic social media use. And here they wanted to look at the relationship between social media use and particularly depression. And here they looked at 55 different studies together with just over 80,000 individuals. And what they found that there was a very small positive significant association between the self-reported symptoms of depression and social media use. But when they looked at problematic social media use, what they actually found was far more significant associations. So if you like, the more problems that you had with social media, the more likely you are to experience depression. So so just before my conclusions, the one thing I want to concentrate on is, well, what's happened in terms of these technological addictions while the pandemic has been going on? And a recently published study looked at a number of studies that have looked at things like internet gaming disorder, online gambling, online pornography, and smartphone addiction. And what this particular study did was looked at 11 studies that had looked at internet addiction, 8 studies that had looked at gaming disorder, 9 of them that had looked at online gambling, 5 studies that had looked at online pornography, and 3 that looked on smartphone addiction. What they found was that the results were there had been an increase in internet-based addictive behaviors during the COVID pandemic, which is probably not surprising because more and more of us were staying indoors, spending more and more time online. However, the one thing I will say about most of the studies they looked at is the studies themselves were usually what we call cross-sectional snapshot studies. These were non-representative samples, usually of very low or moderate quality in terms of the research. So really, when it comes to this particular question of what happened to technological addictions during the pandemic, there are actually insufficient quantitative studies on all these different online behaviors to make a good assessment. And that some behaviors, particularly online pornography and smartphone use disorder, there was actually very, very few studies at all. So what do I conclude from all this? Well, depending on how you define addiction, internet addictions and online addictions do appear to exist. Although time spent online does actually correlate with internet addiction, the one thing I would stress is that lots of people can use technology excessively without having any problematic symptoms whatsoever. So excessive use in and of itself is not necessarily problematic. The medium of the internet may actually be more harmful for certain types of groups. So for instance, the internet may be more problematic for people who are in their late adolescence and emerging adults rather than people who are older aged or very young children. Most of the research that's been carried out suggests that internet addictions, and very specific ones like internet gaming disorder, are more likely to cause problems rather than the kind of generalized internet addiction. And in fact, I often say in my work that people are no more addicted to the internet than alcoholics are addicted to a bottle, because really when we're talking about online addictions, it's not people being addicted to the internet, it's about people being addicted to activities that take place on the internet. So things like online gambling, online gaming, online shopping, online sex. So my real conclusion at the end of the day is that the internet may be addictive, but really for only a very small minority. And I'll end it there and say thank you very much.